This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek Radio and the Labor Video Project, and I'm with David Lee Morgan, who is a writer. He has a play, Science, Love, and Revolution, here at the Fringe Theater in San Francisco. Could you talk about how you came to be a writer and your play, and how you came to go to England?
Well, yeah, that's a lot of questions all in one. How did I become a writer? My first love was painting, and when I went off to study to be a priest when I was 14, they wouldn't let me paint. So my outlet started to become writing instead of painting. And my biggest influences were Woody Guthrie, Dashiell Hammett, and Gerard Manley Hopkins, sort of an odd mix, but all for the Woody Guthrie just for everything about his attitude towards life and revolution and writing and art, and Dashiell Hammett because he was so economical with words, and Gerard Manley Hopkins because, again, his use of words and rhythms. He understood rhythm in ways that people of his age did not, and I learned a lot from him. So that's the first question, I think. How did I get into writing?
So you're an American, and you ended up in Britain. How did that happen?
In 1983, the U.S. was installing Pershing and cruise missiles in Europe, and 90% of the population was against them. They had huge demonstrations, over 1 million people in London, Rome, Paris, Frankfurt, Bonn, 2 million in Hamburg, 1 million in Copenhagen. And I came with a group of revolutionaries to join in the demonstrations in Europe, and my friends came with return tickets. I came with a saxophone, a sleeping bag, and a one-way ticket, and I've stayed there as a street musician ever since.
And what is it like? What is the life of a street musician these days in Europe or around the world?
Well, it's tough. It's tougher in the United States because there's less of a social net. So there's more hungry people on the streets, and you're competing with people who desperately need money. To be the sort of street musician I am is kind of impossible in countries like Tunisia, India, because the equipment I have, a saxophone, an amplifier, a CD player or something like that, it kind of makes me a small capitalist on the streets of countries like that. But so it's easiest to play in Europe, but I've played all over North America, and I've played from Seattle to Montreal to New York to London, Paris, almost every country in Western Europe, and a fair few in Eastern Europe. I was the first street musician to busk in East Germany since before World War II. I got in there the year before the wall came down. They started loosening things up. And I felt like Mick Jagger on tour. I was drawing huge crowds just for my saxophone and backing tracks and singing.
And of course, people in Europe had or people in Eastern Europe, Germany, they had illusions about capitalism. And why don't you talk about that? What happened?
Oh, did they ever? When the first and only time I played in Poland, I played in Krakow, and it was the year before the wall came down in Germany, but also it was the same time in both in East Germany and Poland. They changed the law so that you didn't have to change a certain amount of Westmarks. For me about Poland, I was there as a street musician in January of 1989. The wall came down in Berlin in December of '89, but January 1st in East Germany and in Poland, they changed the law so that you didn't have to change a certain number of Westmarks for every day that you were in those countries. It became possible for the first time not to make a profit because Eastern Bloc money was worthless outside of the Eastern Bloc, but to just go on a busman's holiday, and play music, travel around the country. So when I got to Krakow, I followed the crowds, and it turned out they were going to the center of the city. There were about half a dozen different types of police uniforms. The main one looked like they'd just come off cavalry patrol in the 18th century. And I started playing music and instantly had a huge crowd. In Poland, of course, at the time, everybody hated the Soviet Union and loved the United States. Part of the time I was there, I stayed in a student dormitory that was entirely South American students. So everybody in that dormitory hated the United States and loved the Soviet Union. And the only kind of nearly antagonistic argument I ever got in, I was at a student party where I was telling them that you guys both got it wrong, that both the U.S. and the Soviet Union are imperialist countries, and each is as bad as the other. And the young Polish student got more and more angry and it reached the point where he said, "Oh yeah, well, have you ever been there?" And then stopped, because of course I was from there and he knew that. But yeah, it was. They had a lot of illusions about the U.S. But then also, I found other countries, like I was in Tunisia for the World Social Forum a year ago, and you talk about they're very revolutionary minded, but at the same time they're also saying, but really, we want what you've got. We want TVs and cars and all the kind of the conveniences of life that everyone in the West has. Why can't we have that for starters, and then let's all be equal after that?
And so you've been doing your art, your music around the world. What is going on today in Britain, the Labour Party and the whole political situation, social situation?
Well, I have to say, first of all, I've been doing my art and music mostly around the Northern Hemisphere. I've been a few places, Tunisia and Mumbai for World Social Forums, where I've played a bit. I would like to do more of that, but one of the problems with being a street musician is that you can go to anywhere in the world as long as it's pretty much like where you left. Reasonably wealthy, kind of industrial country. And then I can just pick up my saxophone and hit the road and arrive and start playing in the center of a city and worry about where I'm going to stay when the sun goes down. So what's it like in Britain now? Well, I think it's the same as in the U.S., that although there's more of a social net in Britain, that in general life has been getting tougher and tougher for working people for the last several decades. And you're finding more and more anger, and you're finding that turn in different directions, towards in the UK, towards UKIP, and what is that, the United Kingdom Independence Party, basically a semi-fascist party like Le Pen in France. But it's also going towards Jeremy Corbyn, who's currently the leader of the Labour Party by accident. They changed the rules in a way that let the entire Labour Party vote for Labour leader. And they didn't realize what they'd done until he slaughtered all the opposition, because everyone in the Labour Party, all the rank and file people, were just angry as hell about not just what was happening in the country, but what had been happening under Tony Blair and the Blairites. Probably the biggest issue that unites everyone is the NHS, the National Health Service. Everybody loves that, left, right, Tory, Labour. And why wouldn't they? If you're sick, you just go to the hospital or the doctors and say, "Fix me." And then they sort you out. And there's no paperwork. Does the insurance company say this is okay or that's okay? They do struggle. There is a structural problem, which is that the population is getting older and older, and what you can do medically is expanding every year. So there are some problems with waiting lists, but speaking as someone who never used it for the first 25 years I was there, and now as an intimate friend of the NHS, boy, it's a blessing for everyday people. And I know all of my friends and relatives here in the United States, they're so envious of me and my experience with the NHS compared to what they have to go through. So in general, there's a lot of anger, righteous anger. Some of it's directed in racist, reactionary ways. There's that quote from H.L. Mencken, for every complex problem, there's a solution that is simple, clear, and wrong. And people look for that kind of solution. But there's also people are starting to, there's a stronger, young people are starting to question the system. And you're reaching that point that you hear about from Lenin, where he says people are beginning to question things that they've taken for granted all their lives, where a couple weeks' work is worth decades of work in normal times. And we're not in a crisis now here in England or here in the U.S., but you can see that things are heating up.
And love, science, and revolution, what's that all about?
Science, love, and revolution. Well, as someone pointed out, I mentioned this in the show, you could write that as an equation. Science plus love equals revolution. Because if you have a love for the masses of people and a scientific understanding of how they're being screwed over, how could you not be a revolutionary? It's a collection of poems that I've written. I've been embedded in the spoken word scene in London for the last quite a few years, and it's really exploded over the last decade. And London is the most international city in the world. More languages are spoken in that city than anywhere else. You have poets and artists from every English-speaking country in the world. And spoken word is the type of poetry that puts a premium on telling the truth. So it's kind of been like being in an international university of art and politics. And it's challenged me to, in the face of all this idealism that you find in the spoken word scene, to look at my own life and see what do I have to contribute. And part of what I have to contribute is just that I'm very old. So I've been around for a long time, and I was, I saw Panthers rapping on the streets. I was inspired by the Black liberation struggle, women's liberation, the wars of national liberation around the world, and by China and the Cultural Revolution and the theory of people's war that Mao developed, that the Vietnamese used with such telling effect against the of spoken word pieces. Most of them, I spent 2 or 3 months writing. The final one, What Is to Be Done, which is based on Lenin's book, What Is to Be Done, I spent 3 months just thinking about that and pretty much nothing else and trying to boil it down into what it was about that book that inspired me. And similarly, the first poem is a brief history of the human race told through the evolution of words, starting with mother and banana, and going on through gold, diamonds, the Crusades, Industrial Revolution, pizza, space invaders, onwards towards revolution, of course.
And you've performed this around the world. What's been the response of people to your performance?
Well, poetry has a relatively small audience compared to, of course, we make pots and pots of money as poets. Everybody knows that. But seriously, it has a relatively small audience. Poetry about revolution. What I find is that in London especially, I reach a lot of young, revolutionary-minded people who are really hungry for knowledge and who take what I have to say very seriously and who spur me to go back and think about it some more and try and write more and more in depth. So I've written a sequel to the show that you're going to see, trying to answer questions that have come up from the first one. And now I'm working on, what do you say after sequel, trequel? Or I'm working on the third of a trilogy to answer the questions that have come up from the first two. It's a real learning experience. Comedy and music and easy listening is always going to have a bigger audience, but the audience that I get is the sort of people I've always wanted to talk to and to learn from.
The Fringe Festival, you're at the Exit Theater here in San Francisco. You have thousands of people here on the street, destitute, mostly African American, poor people, people dying on the street. What do you think this says about America and about capitalism?
Well, it says it doesn't work, doesn't it? It says that America not only butchers people around the world, but it has no respect for its own citizens. I bet a lot of those people that I'm passing on the streets are veterans, went over to fight for the United States and have come back. And did you know that in the 1800s that the veterans of the British Empire, their bones were used for fodder for animals? They didn't get buried. They were ground up and used as horse food and cattle food. Did you know that? I learned that at London School of Economics when I did a course in international housing. It's a fact. Veterans have never been respected, and now they get a lot of lip service, but they're still just screwed over. Well, I would say one thing that's kind of different, that there's too much respect for veterans in this country, too much lip service respect and not enough in terms of benefits. But more often in the UK, you also find people saying, it's terrible the way you're being treated, but also you had no business being over there in the first place. And there's a little less tolerance for the fact that they were fighting for an empire and to oppress other people. And there is still an understanding of that they're driven to that. You know, it's economic necessity and ignorance about the world's situation. And God knows I enlisted when I was young. I was young and stupid too. But I was stupid when I did that.
And the United States is now a declining imperialist empire. It's becoming more and more adventurous, 700 bases around the world, more and more wars. And one of the developments is the growth of people like Trump, people that support Trump as a neo-fascist solution. Are you surprised by how much support Trump has? He may be the next president of the United States.
No. You want me to say more? People are really getting fucked over, you know, and they reach out for solutions, and they don't always reach out for the right solution. And especially because the great revolutions of the last century and a half have been defeated, and there's been a massive propaganda onslaught, trashing everything about them. And they made mistakes. We have to learn from their mistakes, but you can't learn from their mistakes unless you understand all the things that they did right. And people don't see that. They don't understand that. They think it's a done deal that they have never even heard of the Paris Commune, but said that the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, that these are all just tyrannies. And so naturally, people, they want hope, and they want to fight back. And often when there's no hope, they reach out for hopeless solutions. Not just Trump, but religious fundamentalism is the same thing, right? I mean, fundamentalism, the Arab, Muslim, Christian fundamentalism. I mean, the scary fundamentalism is Christian, Jewish, Buddhist. The scariest, of course, is Christian, because they get people in the White House with their fingers on the nuclear button.
Next year, 2017, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. What's the lesson of that revolution for today?
The lesson for the 1917 revolution, 100 years. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that it was the 100th anniversary coming up. I would say that it's possible to utterly transform the world and create a new, free human race, but it's not a done deal, and we could equally possibly slide into Armageddon and with the human race wiped out or driven back to the Stone Age, and it's up to us which happens. The revolution will not come until it has pierced your heart, until every cruelty and injustice, no matter who it is done to, feels as if it were done to you, until you are naked, open wide, wounded by every homeless cry, a mother to every hungry child, a native son to every tribe, stranded in the forest flame, swallowing smoke and tears of rage, running from the thunder of a helicopter gun. The revolution will not come until your back aches and the sun bakes you and the pain breaks you, until every minute of your life hurts and the ripe fruit falls down into the dirt because your fingers and your bones and your brain are numb. The revolution will not come until every cop car is looking for you, for what you are, not what you do. And you stand on the earth stranded by the wrong accent, the wrong color skin, the wrong sexuality, the wrong mother tongue, too fat, too thin, too old, too young. The revolution will not come until you walk the street bearing unwanted seed, forced to breed by men who call you girl and think they bloody own the world. Until you stare up into the hate-filled face of a rapist thrusting into you, when you can smell his breath, taste the rancid kiss, when your stomach twists in anger and disgust, when you can feel all this as if it were done to you. It's not enough, because the revolution will not come until it has made you wise. So what if you hate injustice? So what if you're willing to die to make a change? It's not enough to be brave, not even enough to love, unless love leads to wisdom when push comes to shove.
So you learn to read books and faces. You study what gender and race is. You look at science and the economy, at every class and group in society. You study the past, but you don't live in it. You don't worship it. You don't pick through the rubble for a lost God to believe in. You read history not with a branding iron, but a blowtorch. You are not a king. You are not a priest. You are not singing in the bloody choir. You are the fire that burns through history. Your genealogy is written in the ashes of burnt-out villages, crucified slaves, weavers chained to their looms, heretics burned to the stake, screaming out the truth. How many thousands of years of fighting each other over the never enough, one class after another rising to the top and beating back down everyone else with laws and religion and bullets when you don't listen. How many thousands of years of system after system and always the same fundamental division? You work, they rule. But you are more than just a talking tool. Let the revolution be your school. Study the connections, and you begin to see the chains of slavery are chains of power too. They connect you to an army of the dispossessed, and it's an army you will need, because the revolution will not come until it has made you strong. Power is a good thing. Try living without it. But without a doubt, it divides into two. The power to win is the power to lose. Power is nothing but the power to choose. It's only as good as how you use it. But never forget, you are not begging for mercy. You are fighting for power. How will you break free of the ingrained habits of a lifetime? How will you gain control of your own minds? How will you bring it together to set off a chain reaction? And if you win, how will you fight off the armies that come to crush you? And if you win, how will you feed the world? And if you win, how will you carry through? How will you free the world? Be leaders who know how to be led. Be teachers who know how to be taught. Revolution is a war that has to be fought. They got the guns and the weapons of mass communication. You got the power to the people that comes with organization. You got the power to the people, but you better believe they hate it. If you give them a chance, they'll break it. You know, it's only as good as you make it. You got the power to the people. Are you ready to take it? Thank you.